Hello, students. Welcome back to our next segment on biodiversity. You may recall yesterday we talked a little bit about biodiversity and the different kinds of biodiversity. It's not all the same. And we also talked about where biodiversity is threatened in the world. Well, today we're going to talk a little bit more about biodiversity, and we're going to talk about the importance of biodiversity. And then on our next session, we'll talk about some of the threats of biodiversity more specifically. So if you haven't already, open your books to your notes section and let's begin. So biodiversity, a little bit more about it. It is dependent on a few different environmental factors. Yesterday, I showed you the map, in particular the cross section across the United States or North America, and showed you how different topography and elevations affect different biomes or ecosystems across the country. And those different ecosystems certainly affect biodiversity. So I want to pick up basically where we left off last time and discuss a few more items that biodiversity is dependent upon. Here's a list. Temperature. Let's just briefly mention temperature. Temperature is, as we may recall from previous lessons in earth science, is dependent upon solar radiation. The direct rays of the sun hitting the earth at particular angles affects the temperature here on Earth. In general, it is the equatorial regions of our planet, those areas that are near the equator, that are the warmest, and those areas farthest away from the equator, near the poles, are colder. But temperature affects biodiversity. You see, the warmer it is, the greater the variety of organisms that can survive in a particular area. So generally speaking, the higher the temperature, the greater the biodiversity. Precipitation. Precipitation is another factor that is dependent upon geographic location on planet Earth. In particular, there are the equatorial regions that produce tropical rainforests, but we also have temperate rainforests in different areas. And generally speaking, the higher the precipitation, the greater the ability of life forms to exist. You're going to have a greater diversity of life in various ways in some place where there's a lot of moisture compared to zones of the earth like the Sahara Desert and other desert zones on the planet where it is very dry. The biodiversity goes down when it's dry and it goes up when it's wetter. Altitude. Altitude is how high or low something is in the atmosphere. Generally speaking, the lower the altitude, the higher the air pressure, the more moisture and warmth there is, there's going to be greater biodiversity. The higher you go up in a mountain, like here in the Himalayas, the Himalayas are certainly the highest elevations on planet Earth. There's not much biodiversity up there because the air is so thin, it's so cold, and it's also dry. So we've got the equatorial regions that are hot and moist. We've got the desert regions that are dry. We've got high mountains, the altitude. And again, generally speaking, the higher the altitude, the lower the biodiversity. Now, there's another couple factors here as well, soil and geography and the presence of other species. To varying degrees, each of these is dependent upon the first three in the list here, temperature, precipitation, and altitude. And certainly all of this has an effect on biodiversity. And for those of you that might be familiar with Minecraft, there are even rare biome seeds that you can plant. Let's see, the jungle, the mega taiga, the biome, ice spikes biome. Oh, all the different kinds of things you can do on Minecraft to learn about biodiversity. All right, moving right along. So, as I mentioned before, we can write this down now. In general guidelines and general terms, biodiversity is highest in warm, moist, equatorial regions with fertile soil. Those are the places currently on planet Earth that are the richest areas of biodiversity. And when we do talk about biodiversity, remember, we're not just talking about macroorganisms, big critters. We're also talking about microorganisms or small critters as well. So, biodiversity certainly highest in warm, moist, equatorial regions with fertile soil. And one place that comes to my mind when I think of warm, moist, equatorial regions is the rainforest. Rainforests are a treasure trove of biodiversity, which is why there are so many people concerned with the cutting down, the slashing, and the burning of rainforests around the world. Not only are they rich resources of biodiversity, but those particular biomes are also rich in replenishing the oxygen supply on planet Earth and reducing the concentration of carbon dioxide. So, rainforests are incredibly important in many ways, but the way we're considering this week is simply being treasure troves of biodiversity. Now, some of you might be thinking, who cares? I've never been to a rainforest and I probably never will get to a rainforest in my life. So, what do I care if there are thousands of species in a rainforest and only hundreds here? Biodiversity. Who cares? Well, I want to give you some reasons here that maybe if you think about them, perhaps it will cause you to care about biodiversity, maybe just a little bit more. So let's focus on a few reasons. Number one, genetic diversity. We just finished up the topic on genetic engineering, and we've learned about genes previously in the year. And so when we talk about genetic diversity, this is probably a familiar scene to you with all of the nitrogen base pairs. But why is genetic diversity, why should it be important to us? Well, having variability in DNA is critical for the health of species as well as the general health of planet Earth. Let me just give you a quick little example here. Let's say you're a farmer and you grow only one kind of crop, and some kind of pest comes in that is desiring that one crop. That one pest could wipe you out as a farmer because of practicing something we refer to as monoculture, mono meaning one. However, if you have multiple varieties of crops that you're growing and that same pest comes in, yeah, that pest might eradicate that one single variety, but you'll have others backing it up. And that's why genetic diversity is so important, because it promotes survival, not just of plant species, but of animal species as well, by having built in backup plans. Because if there is something, whether it's a disease or a pest, that attacks one variety, it's always good to have a backup plan. I mean, check out this picture here. Look at all of those tomatoes. They are all tomatoes, all different varieties of tomatoes. Let's say you're growing tomatoes in your garden and there's a pest that comes around and attacks all of your beefsteak tomatoes and they wipe them out. Well, if you are fond of tomatoes, it will be nice to know that you would have backup varieties, but it's that way with other things as well. So, just in case one species might disappear into extinction, another species will be able to take its place. This is a very important thing that we as humans should be interested in at the very least. Let me give you one quick story in history that proves this point. And it has to do with a period of Irish history called the Great Potato Blight. That's right. The staple food of Ireland 120 odd years ago were potatoes. And unfortunately, there were a lot of potato farmers that grew the same kind of potato as everybody else. And this blight came along. This nasty pest came in and essentially destroyed the staple crop of Ireland in the late 1800s. So, what happened? People were starving. Lots of people starved to death. People, not potatoes, people were starving to death. And so there was a massive immigration into the United States from Ireland for a number of years, from the Irish people who were looking for better opportunities, better soil conditions, and to get away from the potato blight. But look at this picture here. These are all potatoes. Imagine if farmers grew all of these different kinds of potatoes. Yeah, there might be a potato blight and it might wipe out all of these common potatoes that you're all for, or these potatoes that you're probably all familiar with. But if we've got backup potatoes in the genetic reserves, we won't have to starve to death. We'll have backup food. Okay. Now, unfortunately, over the years, a number of species have, in fact, gone extinct, never to be seen again. Although I know in the last topic we talked about how genetic engineering might be able to bring some extinct organisms back to life. And after this lesson, you might see one of the advantages to doing that, increasing the biodiversity again on the planet. But unfortunately, environmental circumstances and human circumstances have caused the extinction of many, many plants and animals over the last few decades. And the rate of extinction seems to be increasing. And when extinction increases, biodiversity decreases. So that's reason number one. Reason number two, global stability. And this brings us into reason number two. And you'll notice there's a picture here of, I'm sure you can identify them, of these beautiful monarch butterflies. Monarch butterflies migrate thousands of miles over generations. When I was a kid, we used to see thousands of monarch butterflies in the wildflower fields across the street from my house every year. They loved building nests in the milkweeds, one of the staple foods of monarch butterflies. But I have to be honest with you, in recent years, I haven't seen many monarch butterflies at all. In fact, I haven't seen many butterflies, period, in the last few years, which our lab activity on Thursday is going to enlighten us a little bit more about the importance of global stability. But let's talk about global stability a little bit more. Some folks call it the web of life. Having greater biodiversity supports stability. Stability is a state in which there aren't extremes one way or another. And all things in life do seek to be stable. A web of life, increased biodiversity supports stability to avoid the wild extremes. When there are missing links in the web of life, you might be able to sustain the loss of some species of organisms over time. And, that happens periodically. But if you lose too many, global stability will suffer and entire ecosystems can begin to crash. And when ecosystems begin to crash, if they're ecosystems within which we live, it's only a matter of time before we will be detrimentally impacted as well. So, global stability, another important reason why biodiversity is important. Here's a quick little example of the question, why preserve biodiversity? Let me read this to you. What happens if one member of an ecosystem no longer exists? For example, what might happen if a certain type of fish marked with an X dies out of a lake ecosystem, leaving its predators without a food source and its prey without a predator? The food chain might collapse with unpredictable consequences for the ecosystem. Just take one little pond here and notice the diversity of life, starting with humans liking to fish. And this is a good time of year to go fishing. And the top predators like bald eagles, and working our way all the way down to the microscopic organisms that provide food. You take one species out of this ecosystem, it's going to impact all of these other organisms as well. Again, some species, yeah, you might be able to remove them, but there comes a tipping point where the removal of even one more species can put you over that tipping point, and the whole system could end up crashing. All right, let's now discuss number 3, the human benefits of biodiversity. If those first 2 reasons weren't good enough, because you weren't able to follow the direct connection between biodiversity and its impact and importance for humanity, well, let's look at some more direct benefits to the human population from having biodiversity. First, mere scientific value of species is immeasurable. So many of our medicines that help to cure us and save our lives were first identified with either plants or animals. Think about it. Most of our medicines come from other plants and animals. What if one of those species were to have been destroyed and exterminated before we could have gotten the medicine? We wouldn't have many of the medicines we have today. What if? What if the future cure for cancer is found in some small, obscure plant in the tropical rainforests? And all we have to do is identify it. Well, it's going to take scientists to do that, to go out and identify different species and then test different species. It's actually a field of science called ethnobotany, where plants help and benefit humans, healing diseases. But what if we destroy today the plant that was the future cure for cancer? Think about that. The ramifications are immense. Isn't it just a shame to think about just eliminating species willy-nilly because we just don't care about insignificant critters or plants? You never know when one of them might save your life. So, scientific value. Here's another value, economic value. Everybody loves the money argument here. There are so many products and useful chemicals that we also derive from plant and animal sources. If we eliminate the biodiversity that we have on planet Earth, we may be losing out on literally a ton of money that someone could make on products developed from some plant or animal. Let me give you a quick for instance. When cars were first developed, and who doesn't love to drive in a car or want to own your own car one day? They needed tires. So Goodyear developed rubber tires. And you know what that rubber was made out of? Plant sap from the rubber tree. Now the rubber tree is in danger of being a threatened species. But it provides rubber. During World War II, Russia could not obtain enough natural rubber anymore because of the war. And so they actually found a substitute in dandelions. Believe it or not, millions of tank treads were made with dandelion sap. Believe it or not. Again, just two quick examples off the top of my head. Products made with plant materials. I mean, the list is really endless. I mean, just look at your own house. Think about the wood frame from your house that was obtained from trees, certain kinds of trees that can sustain things. So, the bottom line is, why is biodiversity important? That's like our question for today. Here's some other reasons why biodiversity is important. You can jot these down as well. Many jobs are linked to a nation's biodiversity. Right now in the world, and this is a good thing, there are countries in the world whose entire gross domestic product, all of the money that they make, is based on ecotourism. They make their money because people from developed parts of the world want to see the biodiversity that doesn't exist where they live, so they go to some place where it does exist and spend a lot of money going on vacations to these particular areas. So tourists can bring money to countries mainly to see its biodiversity of plants and animals. That is becoming, I think thankfully so, in order to protect the biodiversity, we should be promoting it and encouraging people to check it out. Many products and medicines we've already mentioned that we use come from our biodiversity. So I've mentioned a lot of these ideas already, these things, but I would like you to consider some of these reasons when you are asked the question, why is biodiversity important? Hopefully you can give a few reasons, like maybe on this week's quiz. Hint, hint. But until next time, I'll say bye-bye.